In the early hours of July 17, 1918, in a cramped, whitewashed basement in the Ural Mountains city of Yekaterinburg, a family of 7 and 4 of their most loyal servants were told they were being moved somewhere safer. They were led downstairs, arranged in 2 uneven rows as if for a photograph nobody would ever take, and told to wait for a car that did not exist. Chairs were even brought in for the sick boy and his mother to sit on, a small mercy that made what came next feel even crueler in hindsight. Then a squad of armed men walked through the door and read aloud an order. Within minutes, the last Tsar of Russia, his wife, and their 5 children were dead, along with the family doctor, the cook, the maid, and the footman who had refused to leave them behind. It was the end of a dynasty that had ruled Russia for more than 300 years. It was also the beginning of one of the strangest afterlives in modern history, a mystery that would take almost 80 years to untangle, filled with secret graves, false claimants, and DNA tests that finally answered questions nobody thought could ever be answered. This is the story of what really happened to the Romanovs. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand how it ended, you have to understand the family that Nicholas II was born into and the empire he was never quite prepared to rule. The Romanov dynasty had governed Russia since 1613, and by the time Nicholas took the throne in 1894, following the sudden death of his father Alexander III, the empire he inherited was the largest country on earth, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. It was also a country groaning under its own weight, and Nicholas was 26 years old when he inherited it, with almost no preparation for the job. Alexander III had been a physically imposing man who ruled with total confidence, and he assumed there would be plenty of time to train his eldest son before handing over the throne. There was not. When his father died unexpectedly of kidney disease, Nicholas reportedly turned to a brother-in-law in tears, asking what he was supposed to do now, saying he had no idea how to be a sovereign and had never even wanted to be one. Within days, he was expected to receive foreign ambassadors, sign decrees, and preside over a funeral and a wedding almost simultaneously, since his marriage to Alexandra of Hesse, a German princess and granddaughter of Britain's Queen Victoria, had already been arranged and could not easily be postponed. The wedding took place just weeks after the funeral, in an atmosphere so heavy with mourning that some at court considered it a bad omen for the reign to come. His coronation the following year, in May of 1896, produced an omen that was far harder to dismiss. During the public celebrations in Moscow, a crowd gathered on Khodynka Field for the distribution of free food and souvenir cups, and rumors that the gifts were running out triggered a stampede. Nearly 1,400 people were crushed to death. Nicholas, following the advice of his uncles, chose to attend a scheduled ball at the French embassy that same evening rather than cancel the festivities, a decision that struck much of the public as coldly indifferent and followed him for the rest of his reign. The marriage itself, whatever its rocky start, turned out to be a genuine love match, one of the more affectionate royal marriages of the era, and the couple went on to have 4 daughters in quick succession: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, girls who by most accounts grew up close and playful, sharing bedrooms in pairs, referring to themselves collectively by the acronym Atma formed from their initials, and largely sheltered from the wider political currents swirling around their father's throne. Nicholas's reign, in the meantime, was proving far rockier than the quiet family life inside the palace suggested. In January of 1905, on a day that came to be known as Bloody Sunday, Imperial troops opened fire on a peaceful crowd of workers marching toward the Winter Palace to present a petition, killing dozens and igniting a wave of strikes and unrest that historians now treat as a dress rehearsal for the revolution still to come. Nicholas was forced that same year to grant Russia its first elected legislature, the Duma, a body he tolerated but never fully respected, repeatedly dissolving it and rewriting the electoral rules whenever it produced results he disliked. It was against this backdrop of an emperor still clinging to absolute authority in an era rapidly leaving absolute monarchs behind that the couple finally welcomed a son, Alexei, in 1904. His birth should have secured the dynasty for another generation. Instead, it introduced the family's deepest and most carefully hidden secret. Alexei had inherited hemophilia, a blood disorder that Alexandra carried through her grandmother Victoria's bloodline, and any small bump or fall could trigger internal bleeding that left him in agony for days or weeks at a time. The condition was kept almost entirely from the Russian public, on the assumption that a visibly fragile heir would weaken the dynasty's image, a decision that would have consequences far beyond the family itself. It was Alexei's illness that opened the door for a Siberian peasant and self-styled holy man named Grigori Rasputin to enter the innermost circle of the imperial family. Rasputin had a genuine, almost inexplicable ability to calm the boy during his worst bleeding episodes, whether through hypnotic suggestion, sheer force of personality, or something else entirely, and Alexandra came to believe he was the only person keeping her son alive. What began as a mother's desperate gratitude curdled, over the following decade, into a political liability the dynasty could not afford. Rumors about Rasputin's influence over the court, many exaggerated, some entirely true, spread through the aristocracy and the wider public, feeding a growing sense that the imperial family was mystical, out of touch, and increasingly irrational at the exact moment Russia needed steady leadership. That moment arrived in 1914, when Russia was drawn into the First World War against Germany and Austria-Hungary. Early enthusiasm gave way within a year to catastrophic losses, chronic shortages of rifles and ammunition, and a war effort that was visibly failing. In 1915, against the advice of nearly every minister he had, Nicholas made a decision that many historians consider the single most damaging choice of his reign. He left the capital to take personal command of the army at the front, a symbolic gesture meant to rally the troops, and in doing so left Alexandra in charge of domestic affairs back in Petrograd. This meant that for the war's most difficult stretch, a German-born empress, already viewed with suspicion because of her ancestry, was effectively running the government, and she was leaning heavily on Rasputin's advice for ministerial appointments. Ministers were hired and fired in bewildering succession. Corruption and incompetence multiplied at every level. By late 1916, a group of aristocrats, convinced Rasputin was destroying the monarchy from within, lured him to the Yusupov Palace and murdered him, poisoning him, shooting him, and finally drowning him beneath the ice of the Neva River. His death did nothing to slow the collapse already underway. By February of 1917, bread shortages, war exhaustion, and years of accumulated resentment boiled over into open revolution in Petrograd. Soldiers ordered to fire on protesting crowds instead turned their rifles over and joined them. Within days, the uprising was beyond anyone's control, including Nicholas's own generals, who told him bluntly, in a series of telegrams sent from army headquarters around the country, that continuing to rule was no longer possible and that abdication was the only path that might save the monarchy in some form. On March 15, 1917, aboard his own private train, halted at a rail junction because revolutionary crowds controlled the lines ahead, Nicholas signed an abdication document, first for himself and then, after brief consideration, for his hemophiliac son as well, since he could not bear the thought of separating from Alexei during what he assumed would be a dangerous transition. He passed the crown instead to his brother Michael. Michael, seeing exactly how untenable the position had become, declined the throne the following day, asking instead that the country's future be decided by an elected assembly. Just like that, after 304 years, the House of Romanov stopped ruling Russia. Nicholas wrote in his diary that night with a strange, clipped detachment, noting mostly the time and the weather, as though he could not yet process what he had just signed away. What followed was house arrest, first at the Alexander Palace outside Petrograd, where the family lived under armed guard, but with a surprising degree of normalcy, tending a small vegetable garden they planted themselves, sawing firewood, and continuing the children's lessons with the tutors, who chose to remain with them. The provisional government that had replaced the monarchy, led eventually by the lawyer and politician Alexander Kerensky, worried simultaneously about royalist plots to rescue the family and revolutionary mobs wanting to punish them, and decided the safest option was distance from the capital entirely. In August of 1917, the family was quietly moved by train under an assumed identity to Tobolsk, a remote town in western Siberia chosen partly because it had no rail line, making a sudden rescue or a sudden mob attack equally difficult to organize. They were held in the former governor's mansion, and conditions there were relatively gentle by the standards of what came next. They had space, servants who had chosen exile over safety, occasional church visits, and even sympathetic townspeople who left small gifts at the gate. Nicholas spent part of each day sawing firewood and reading aloud to his family in the evenings, and for a time the household almost resembled ordinary provincial life rather than captivity. That changed gradually as 1917 wore on, and local Bolshevik Soviets began asserting more direct authority over the region, replacing the relatively courteous guard detachment that had traveled with the family from Petrograd with rougher local militia, cutting their food allowances and restricting the family's movement outside the mansion's fence until even short walks in the garden required special permission that was not always granted. That relative calm ended when the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power in Petrograd in October of 1917 and gradually tightened their grip on the country through the winter and spring that followed. In April of 1918, the family was moved again, this time to Yekaterinburg, a city firmly under Bolshevik control deep in the Ural Mountains and considered far enough from any anti-Bolshevik forces to be secure. They were housed in a merchant's home requisitioned for the purpose, and renamed, with a bureaucratic bluntness that still unsettles historians today, the House of Special Purpose. Its windows were painted over and boarded so no one inside could see out, and nothing inside could be seen from the street. A tall wooden fence went up around the entire perimeter, and a second, inner fence went up not long after. The family that had once ruled an empire of 130 million people was now confined to a handful of upstairs rooms, watched around the clock by guards, many of them former factory workers, with little sympathy left for who their prisoners used to be. Meals grew sparse and repetitive. The daughters were made to play the piano for the entertainment of guards who lounged in doorways smoking, and crude graffiti mocking the family began appearing on the walls of rooms they were forced to pass through daily. Nicholas, who had spent his entire life addressed with elaborate formal titles, was now referred to by his guards using only his surname, a small daily humiliation that his own diary entries suggest bothered him far less than it seemed to bother those around him, since by that point he appeared to have made an uneasy peace with however the story was going to end. Alexei was frequently confined to bed during this period, his hemophilia flaring after the strain of repeated travel over rough roads, and his father reportedly carried him from room to room himself, something no reigning czar had ever had to do for a child in the entire history of the dynasty. The daughters, meanwhile, spent their final weeks quietly sewing jewels into their corsets and undergarments, hiding diamonds and other gemstones inside buttons and padded linings, ostensibly to preserve some family wealth in case of a sudden escape. It was a decision that would matter enormously, and gruesomely, on the night of their deaths. Outside the house, the Russian Civil War was accelerating. The anti-Bolshevik Czechoslovak Legion, a force of former prisoners of war making its way east along the Trans-Siberian Railway, was advancing toward Yekaterinburg through the early summer of 1918, and local Bolshevik authorities, fearing the imperial family might be rescued and turned into a rallying symbol for the counter-revolution, made a decision that has been debated by historians for over a century. Whether the direct order to kill the family came from Lenin himself in Moscow, or from local officials in the Urals acting on their own initiative, remains disputed to this day, but the outcome is not. On the night of July 16th into the early morning of July 17th, the family and their 4 remaining servants, the physician Eugene Botkin, the cook Ivan Karatonov, the footman Alexei Troop, and the maid Anna Demidova, were woken and told to dress and come downstairs, supposedly because unrest in the city made the upper floor unsafe. They were led into a small, nearly bare basement room and told to wait. When the death squad entered, led by the local Cheka commandant Yakov Yurovsky, and the sentence was read aloud, Nicholas reportedly had time only to say the word "what," turning halfway toward his family, before the shooting began. The room was small, the group of prisoners large, and the execution turned chaotic almost immediately. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything, and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Bullets ricocheted off the jewels sewn into the daughter's clothing, and several family members survived the initial volley of gunfire, only to be finished off with bayonets and additional shots at close range, as the smoke and dust in the enclosed room made it hard for the executioners to see clearly what they had and had not accomplished. Witnesses among the guards later described it as an agonizingly long and disorganized several minutes, rather than the swift, clean execution Yurovsky had planned on paper. What happened afterward was almost as chaotic as the killing itself. The bodies were loaded onto a truck and driven out of the city into the surrounding forest, to a site the execution squad had scouted in advance, near an abandoned mine shaft known locally as Ganina Yama. The plan to dispose of the remains down the shaft ran into immediate problems, the mine proving too shallow to properly conceal 9 bodies, and the truck carrying them also became stuck in mud along the forest road, costing precious hours of darkness. Yurovsky, improvising through the night with dawn approaching and local peasants beginning to stir nearby, eventually ordered the bodies moved to a second location a short distance away, where they were stripped of clothing and jewels, doused in sulfuric acid to disfigure the faces in slow decomposition, and partially burned before being buried in a shallow pit beneath a rough forest road, covered over with railway ties and packed earth to disguise the disturbed ground from anyone who might pass by. 2 of the 11 bodies, believed for decades afterward to be Alexei and one of his sisters, were burned separately in a small fire nearby and buried in their own isolated grave a short distance from the rest, a detail that would cause enormous confusion for investigators 3 generations later. The Bolshevik government initially announced only that Nicholas himself had been executed, describing it as a decision forced by the approaching Czechoslovak Legion, without acknowledging publicly that his wife and children had died alongside him. That partial version of events was maintained for years, even as rumors of the full massacre spread through Russia and eventually the wider world. The White Army, fighting the Bolsheviks in the civil war that would consume the country for years afterward, captured Yekaterinburg just 8 days after the killings, and launched an investigation led by an examining magistrate named Nikolai Sokolov. Sokolov's team spent months combing the forest near Ganina Yama and found personal effects, bullet fragments, burned belt buckles, a fragment of pearl earring, and other physical traces at the site, enough to conclude with real confidence that the family had been murdered there and their remains deliberately destroyed. The actual bodies themselves, however, were never recovered by his investigation, and Sokolov died in exile in France in 1924, poor and largely ignored by the Western governments he had hoped would take up his findings, still believing the remains had been entirely incinerated and scattered rather than buried nearby. His published report became, for the next several decades, essentially the only detailed account of the killings available to the outside world, and it shaped popular understanding of the event for 2 generations before anyone had access to Yurovsky's own version of what happened that night. That version existed the entire time, sitting quietly in Soviet archives. Yakov Yurovsky, the commandant who had led the execution, wrote a detailed internal report on the killings and the disposal of the bodies sometime around 1920, intended for Communist Party historians rather than public release, and it remained classified for close to 70 years. It was not until the late 1980s, as Soviet censorship began loosening under Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of openness, that the Russian historian and writer Edvard Radzinsky gained access to the document in state archives and began piecing together, for the first time in decades, an accurate account of where the bodies had actually gone. Radzinsky's research ran parallel to, and eventually helped confirm, the location Avdonin and Ryabov had already quietly identified back in 1979, and together the 2 threads of investigation finally converged on the same patch of forest road outside Yekaterinburg. For most of the 20th century, that absence of physical remains left a vacuum that got filled with theories, hopes, and outright fraud. The most persistent of those was the story of a young woman pulled from a Berlin canal in 1920 after an apparent suicide attempt, who eventually, from a psychiatric hospital bed, began claiming to be Grand Duchess Anastasia, the youngest daughter, somehow surviving the execution and fleeing across Europe. She took the name Anna Anderson, and her claim captivated the public for over 60 years, inspiring books, a Hollywood film starring Ingrid Bergman that won an Academy Award, and bitter legal battles with surviving Romanov relatives, most of whom dismissed her outright while a small, devoted circle believed her completely and funded her for decades. She maintained the claim until her death in Virginia in 1984, and it would take DNA science developed long after she was already buried to finally settle, in scientific terms, exactly who she had really been. Inside the Soviet Union, meanwhile, the actual location of the burial site had become one of the more unusual open secrets in 20th century history. A geologist and amateur historian named Alexander Avdonin, working together with a Moscow filmmaker named Gaily Ryabov, who had gained access to old Cheka documents, spent years tracking down the burial location through archival records and interviews with elderly locals, and finally located what they believed was the grave in 1979. Understanding exactly how politically dangerous the discovery was under a still-functioning Soviet system that had never publicly reckoned with the killings, the 2 men quietly reburied what they had found and told almost no one, sitting on the secret for over a decade out of genuine fear of the consequences. Only as the Soviet Union itself began visibly collapsing in the late 1980s did they feel it might finally be safe to come forward, revealing the location publicly for the first time in 1991. An official excavation that same year recovered 9 sets of skeletal remains from the site, roughly matching what investigators expected to find for Nicholas, Alexandra, 3 of their 5 children, and the 4 servants, but conspicuously missing 2 bodies, which most researchers at the time assumed were Alexei and one of his sisters, consistent with Yurovsky's own written account decades earlier describing a separate, smaller burial nearby. Establishing with certainty that these particular bones truly belonged to the Imperial family required forensic science that had not existed anywhere in the world in 1918. British geneticists working with DNA extracted from the recovered bones cross-referenced it against genetic samples provided by living Romanov relatives scattered across Europe, and in a detail that captured public imagination at the time, against Britain's own Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, who shared maternal ancestry with Alexandra through Queen Victoria's line and provided a direct mitochondrial match confirming the identities of the Empress and her daughters beyond reasonable scientific doubt. In July of 1998, 80 years almost to the day after the killings, the recovered remains were formally reburied with state honors in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, the traditional resting place of Russian emperors going back centuries, in a ceremony attended by Russia's president and by descendants of the extended Romanov family who traveled in from across the world for it. The 2 missing bodies were not located until 2007, when a separate excavation team, working from clues in Yurovsky's own decades-old confession, found a second and much smaller grave a short distance from the first, containing badly burned and fragmented bone consistent with a teenage boy and a young woman in her early 20s. Additional DNA testing over the following years, conducted by multiple independent laboratories in different countries to satisfy skeptics, confirmed what many researchers had already suspected, that these were the remains of Alexei and his sister Maria, finally accounting for every member of the immediate family and closing the last open physical question about their fate. The identification also settled, definitively and for good, the Anna Anderson mystery that had run for the better part of a century. DNA testing carried out on a preserved tissue sample from her old medical records showed no genetic relation whatsoever to the Romanov family, and instead matched a living relative of a Polish factory worker named Franciszka Szankowska, a woman with a documented history of mental illness who had disappeared from a Berlin rooming house around the same time Anderson first surfaced from the canal. The most famous imposter story of the 20th century turned out, in the end, to have a mundane and rather sad explanation behind it. The Russian Orthodox Church, for its part, had been building toward its own reckoning with the family's memory for years. In August of 2000, the Church canonized Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children as passion bearers, a specific category of Orthodox sainthood reserved for those who met a violent death with Christian humility rather than through active martyrdom for their faith, a designation that acknowledged both the horror of what happened to them in that basement and the far more complicated, often heavily criticized legacy of Nicholas's own 2 decades on the throne. Even the resting place of Alexei and Maria's remains became tangled afterward in church politics and competing forensic reviews for years, with senior church officials at times publicly questioning the 2007 findings even as independent scientific consensus around the world grew steadily firmer with each new round of testing, a reminder that for this particular family, even the most rigorously settled facts have had to fight repeatedly to stay settled. What lingers about the Romanovs, well over a century on, is not really the politics of the revolution that ended them, though that revolution reshaped the entire 20th century in ways still being felt today. It is the strange, drawn-out afterlife of the mystery itself, the 70-plus years in which nobody outside a handful of frightened Soviet officials could say with certainty where the family's bodies actually were, the fraudulent claimants who built entire careers and courtroom battles out of that uncertainty, the 2 amateur historians who solved the puzzle in 1979 and then had to sit in complete silence with the answer for 12 more years because the truth was still too politically dangerous to speak aloud. 5 children who grew up cloistered inside palaces, taught languages and music and etiquette for a world they were meant to help rule one day, ended up as anonymous, scattered bones in a Siberian forest for 8 decades, identified in the end not by crowns or bloodlines in any symbolic sense at all, but by a genetic match pulled quietly from the mitochondria of a British prince. Nicholas II is remembered by most historians today as a well-meaning but poorly equipped ruler, a devoted husband and father who governed his country badly at the exact hinge point where an old world was ending and a far more violent new one was already tearing its way in. He did not choose the moment history dropped him into, and in the end, neither did the 5 children who died beside him on the floor of that basement for the simple, unchosen fact of having been born into his family. There is something particularly haunting about the ordinariness that surrounded their final months. The piano playing for bored guards, the vegetable garden in Tobolsk, the letters Olga and Tatiana wrote describing homesickness and boredom rather than fear, right up until the very last weeks. None of the 5 children left behind a diary entry suggesting they understood, even at the end, how close the danger actually was. Alexandra's own diary, kept almost daily until 2 days before the killing, records small domestic details, prayers, and notes about Alexei's health, with no hint that she grasped what was coming. That gap between the family's own quiet, almost mundane final chapter and the violence that ended it is part of what has kept the story alive in public imagination for so long, resurfacing in films, operas, and documentaries in nearly every decade since. The site outside Yekaterinburg, where the family was killed and briefly buried, is today marked by a monastery, the Monastery of the Holy Royal Passion Bearers, built directly on the grounds of the old Ipatiev house, which Soviet authorities demolished in 1977 on direct orders from a regional Communist Party official named Boris Yeltsin, worried that the building itself was becoming an unofficial pilgrimage site even under Soviet rule. Yeltsin would go on, in one of history's stranger turns, to become the first president of post-Soviet Russia and to personally attend the 1998 reburial of the family's remains in St. Petersburg less than 3 decades after ordering the destruction of the house where they died. Pilgrims now travel to both sites every July, retracing on foot the same forest road the truck carrying the bodies once got stuck on, a route now marked with wooden crosses and small chapels built over the exact intersections where the story quietly went underground for the better part of a century before finally, bone by bone, coming back into the light. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.